I think I once experienced a track in which the Savior returned, but I experienced it just briefly. I am not there now. I am not sure I ever was. Certainly I may never be again. I grieve for that loss, but loss it is. Somehow I moved laterally, but then fell back, and then it was gone. A vanished mountain and a stream, the sound of bells, and all gone now for me, entirely gone. I, in my stories and novels, often write about counterfeit worlds, semi-real worlds, as well as deranged private worlds, inhabited often by just one person, while meantime the other characters either remain in their own worlds throughout, or are somehow drawn into one of the peculiar ones. This theme occurs in the corpus of my 27 years of writing. At no time did I have a theoretical or conscious explanation for my preoccupation with these pluriform pseudo-worlds, but now I think I understand. What I was sensing was the manifold of partially actualized realities lying tangent to what evidently is the most actualized one, the one which the majority of us, by consensus gentium, agree on.
In 1952, the Democratic Party adopted the defining political slogan of the age, "Don't let them take it away, you never had it so good." They were right. In the early 1950s, the United States of America was, by every measure, the greatest country in the world. It was entering an era of unprecedented economic expansion in human history, and propped up by mass employment and a wave of new, magical-seeming consumer goods. Products like the washing machine, the fridge freezer, the instant camera, and the plastic credit card were completely changing everyday life. It was the age of comforting television and effortless conformity. Glass screens curating a clear picture of consumer contentment, corporate benevolence, and social unity. Programs like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver would soon become the definitive cultural templates of this era. More than entertainment, they were electric pamphlets for the new society of middle-class, all-American success. It was a time of what would become known as the beginnings of consumerism, and following the tragedy of World War II was a surreal period of peace, abundance, and security. Yet there existed another side to the sheen, one ripe with a propensity for unrest and disillusion. This was the nuclear age, and despite all the happy dreamers, the most nightmarish weapon, the H-bomb, was being openly tested and readied, and what would become the inanimate protagonist of the Cold War. It was then, in 1952, at age 23, that Philip K. Dick became a published writer. He was still living with Cleo in a cheap communal apartment in Berkeley, surrounded by the activists of the rebel underground, when he saw himself in print for the first time, and it brought on a rush and elation. The Planet Stories editor, Jack O'Sullivan, had written Philip an encouraging letter praising Beyond Lies the Wub as a very fine little story, a much longed for affirmation of his writing ability, and a dream that Philip had given up on a mainstream and stable life to follow. But the true reality of working as a writer soon became apparent. The payment for Beyond Lies the Wub was $15, and there was no stable publishing contract to follow. The average rent in Philip's neighborhood was about $50 a month, and working full-time at minimum wage would have brought in twice what he'd made with the story. And if he was going to continue to write for a living, even in relative poverty with no savings, he would have to write and sell a complete work of fiction every week with zero rejections. Despite all this, he persevered, and over the course of 1952, up until the end of 1953, Philip wrote and sold 62 short stories, an accomplishment and an output that many writers would never achieve over their entire careers. His relentless production was managed by the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, which he'd signed with in the spring of 1952. With his agency aggressively flooding the market, Philip wrote entirely original works, edited them, and successfully sold them every 9 or 10 days. He sold to virtually every pulp science fiction magazine of the era: If, Galaxy, Imagination, Orbit, and Astounding Science Fiction. In these early short stories, Philip, just as he would subvert society, reality, and eventually his own psyche, began to subvert science fiction. While other contemporary authors like Robert A. Heinlein or Isaac Asimov celebrated technological progress, space colonization, and the triumph of humanity in pristine, orderly expansion, Philip's stories were those of anxious protagonists, faulty machines, and environments prone to sudden decomposition. In stories like The Variable Man and Second Variety, technology is not a tool of human liberation, but an autonomous, horrifying force that eludes human control, mirroring the growing anxiety of a society trapped in the grip of what Eisenhower would dub the military-industrial complex. Philip was beginning to realize that the corporate state's obsession with efficiency and conditioning was stripping humanity of its flaws, of its absoluteness, of its theological quality, and of its empathy. These early ideas would later manifest fully in his novels, particularly with the manufactured, empathy-driven religion of Mercerism, or the instant fix of pleasure commodified in the dial-up Penfield mood organ in DeAndroid's Dream of Electric Sheep.
As I said in the introduction in Unearth, in Berkeley at that time, it was the goal of everyone to be a writer, but we didn't conceive of it by and large in terms of being a published writer. That is, writing as a economic consideration. I mean, people wrote the way, for instance, a person writes a poem, he doesn't expect to make a living off it.
That's right. You said you were looked at actually as almost having sort of sold out in some peculiar.
Yes, well, this really, I think I exaggerated that somewhat. That wasn't the general view, but it wasn't customary. It was not customary to submit one's writing after one wrote a story to submit it to a magazine. And the people who read science fiction were a very distinct, small, separate group of people cut off from the general Berkeley intellectual community. There was no concourse between the science fiction people and the greater intellectual community, cultural community surrounding the university.
By late 1953, the sheer exhaustion of the short story market, paired with his agent Scott's advice that the paperback novel was coming back, persuaded Philip to return to writing novels. This was not a new form for him. Despite working for pulp magazines to get by, Philip had already written his first long-form manuscript, Gather Yourselves Together, in 1952. Set against the backdrop of the 1949 Chinese Communist Revolution, the novel follows 3 American employees stranded at a decommissioned company site. It was a dense, dialogue-heavy rumination on lost innocence and political isolation, featuring an anxious young protagonist who was clearly Philip behind a thin literary veil. This was followed by Voices from the Street, a cold, naturalistic reflection on the American dream. The narrative centered on Stuart Hadley, a deeply alienated young man working in a television repair shop. Consumed by a nameless, suffocating existential dread, surrounded by the consumer abundance of the early 50s, Hadley spirals into a slow, alcohol-fueled breakdown, another clear reflection of Philip's own growing struggles. Neither of these dense, realistic novels sold, but the motifs and characters that would form part of the late greatness were set down. Philip, who as an anxious young man had repaired electronics at University Radio in Berkeley, would later become Jack Bolan in Martian Timeslip, a deeply alienated mechanic on Mars who uses the predictable, logical laws of circuitry as a psychological shield against a reoccurring schizophrenia. He would become John Isidore in DeAndroid's Dream of Electric Sheep, or J.F. Sebastian in Blade Runner, a lonely outcast seen as a simpleton and a fool. But John seems to be the only character plagued with a profound sense of loss and isolation in a dying world, working for a robotic repair shop that masquerades as a veterinary hospital so his clients can hide their social shame of owning artificial animals instead of real ones. The themes and the voice were coming, but the realistic novels were not yet sellable. Scott Meredith advised Philip to instead use the science fiction settings that he'd already been working on to write, and this would lead to his debut novel. Written in 1954, Philip K. Dick's first novel, Solar Lottery, was published by Ace Books in 1955 as part of the Ace Double series. Engineered by New York publisher A. A. Wynn and editor Donald A. Wollhelm, the Ace Double was the ultimate commodity of the pulp era, a cheap head-to-tail paperback that sold at newsstands for 35 cents. The books had 2 front covers and no back cover. A reader would finish one novel, flip the book completely upside down, and begin reading the second novel from the reverse side. Using an original, creative marketing strategy, Ace Books bound the novel by the bankable, established author on one side to carry the risk of the unproven writer on the other. Philip's debut novel was issued as Ace Double D103, bound back-to-back with The Big Jump by the popular and established lay bracket. For Philip, who was already hyper-attuned to the state's obsession with efficiency and the art-destroying nature of mass production, the reality of the Ace Double format held a dark irony. Because 2 books had to conform to a standardized spine thickness for shipping, Ace editors casually chopped and abridged manuscripts without an author's consent to ensure the physical layout. Also, the 35-cent price meant that the already very small royalties had to be split between 2 writers. Over 10,000 words were cut from the novel, and Philip was paid a flat advance of $750, about 2 months of average wages at the time. Most quick, professional writers could hope at best to write a novel a year. This would mean for Philip, even as a published writer, he would still be well below the poverty line, unless he wrote several novels in a year. Philip's coming visions of degraded output in the age of mass consumerism were realized in his own work at its very inception. Solar Lottery, however, was pivotal. Not just because it was Philip's first published novel, but because it was, for the first time, his attempt to truly give the depth and reach of his literary and personal feelings the science fiction format which would make him as a writer, and create the legacy which would change how science fiction itself was viewed. Solar Lottery is set in the year 2203, in a world controlled by corporate giants. Social and political power no longer arise from institutions, but are distributed and governed by a lottery, the Quizmastership. Even the ruler of the world, called the Quizmaster, is selected at random by a machine called the Twitch, keeping power random and chaotic. Previous nightmarish visions of the future, like 1984, published in 1949, just a few years earlier, always viewed the government as all-powerful, and imagined monopolistic, monochrome societies as a result. Solar Lottery mirrored the modernizing revolution that corporate America was undergoing, and what would a generation later become the cliché-ridden fear of the dystopian genre. By the 1970s and 80s, it would lead to a generation of writers and filmmakers with cynical visions like Soylent Green, Alien, and The Terminator. Ultimately, it would be the adoption of the cyberpunk genre, which Philip K. Dick essentially mainstreamed. And what would become the classic Philip K. Dick protagonist, Ted Bentley is a skilled technician who finds himself forced to swear a feudal oath of allegiance to a corporation to survive. It was the underlying dilemma that had haunted Philip since his first marriage and leaving home, the prospect of normality and stability at the expense of giving up his art. Philip also introduced a concept that we fully realized in his later novels, like The Penultimate Truth in 1964 and The Unteleported Man in 66, the monetization of thought and information control. The corporations in Solar Lottery manipulate the populace through massive media broadcasts and engineered spectacles, creating a population so distracted by the lottery that they're incapable of recognizing their own subjugated existence. Solar Lottery had sold over 100,000 copies as an ace double, and for that, Philip was paid a few $100s, enough to continue to live in poverty for a few months. If he wanted to carry on as a writer, he'd have to continue to grind out Pulp Fiction. He may have rallied against the domination of the corporate state and the dreams of his fiction, but in waking life, he was as much a part of it as ever. Despite his newly found commercial success within the science fiction genre, Philip was still torn creatively. Throughout the mid-1950s, he was consumed by a desperate desire for validation from the mainstream intellectual and literary establishment in which he was immersed. He still considered science fiction a financial compromise, knowing it was not taken seriously in literary culture. Although he continued to write science fiction that sold, his passion for the realist American novel remained clear. And while he composed narratives about starships, time travel, and telepathic mutants by day to pay the rent, he spent his nights attempting high-prose, ultra-realist modernist novels. These works targeted the quiet, psychological decay of a generation chilled by the damp of the creeping Cold War. Between 1955 and 1956, Philip produced a series of powerful, non-science fiction manuscripts, including Mary and the Giant and The Broken Bubble. These novels were completely devoid of speculative features. Instead, they were deeply psychological, naturalistic examinations of characters trapped within the economic and social confines of the Bay Area. Philip sent these manuscripts to the major literary publishing houses in New York, still convinced that they represented his true artistic calling. Editors at houses like Knopf, Harcourt Brace, and Simon & Schuster rejected every single manuscript. The literary establishment found his realism too abrasive, his prose too casual, and his vision of American life too bleak. And they couldn't understand a writer who refused to celebrate the triumphs of the modern middle class or dared to suggest fracture lines in the nuclear family. These rejections were a catastrophic blow to Philip and cemented a profound sense of exclusion and being fundamentally misunderstood.
I had read a lot of psychology, I read a lot of Jung, and I was interested in Jung's idea of projection, and that is that a lot of what we experience as external to us is really projected from our unconscious. And that meant, of course, that each person's world had to be somewhat different than everybody else's because the contents of his unconscious would be, to a certain extent, unique. And I began a series of stories in which people experienced worlds which were projections of their own psyches. And I was doing this when I first began to sell, like Rube, my first story, is a perfect example of what I was trying to do, where the dog sees the world completely different from the way human beings see the world. And although it's a fantasy, it was related to a very large number of stories that I wrote which were not precisely fantasies and were simply not marketable because they were neither fantasies, they had no fantasy premise, nor were they realistic. And what I called them was interior projection stories. And I tried to explain, I already had, by that time I had Scott Meredith as my agent, and he couldn't sell them and didn't want to handle them. And I tried to explain what I was trying to do, and that was I was showing each person with a different world, and the contents of that world consisting to a large degree of material from his own mind, which came back at him from outside, and which he did not recognize as his own mind coming back at him from outside. Now this is an idea that has never left me, that a good deal of what each of us experiences is a projection of his unconscious, and it's not, as I say, it was Jung's idea, not mine. And it's an idea that grew stronger in me rather than weaker, but I had to abandon eventually writing everything except science fiction and fantasy, because although I wrote 11 novels and many short stories which were not science fiction or fantasy, they all contained the element of the projected personal unconscious or projected collective unconscious, and were simply incomprehensible to anyone who read them, because it would require you to accept my premise, which essentially was that each of us lives in a unique world.
Philip returned to the science fiction novel with The World Jones Made, another 35-cent ace double. It was set in a post-apocalyptic 2002, in a world tightly managed by a world government called FedGov, which enforces an ideology known as Hoff's relativism. Under this regime, absolute truths, political fanaticism, and dogmatic opinions are illegal. The central figure, Floyd Jones, a morose and impoverished carnival fortune teller, possesses the mutant ability to see exactly 1 year into the future. When his absolute predictions break the law of relativism, he clashes with the FedGov agent Doug Cusick. Jones eventually uses this gift to whip up a fanatical xenophobic movement around himself to overthrow the government. The idea that humanity's ability to see into the future would end up as telepaths for hire or solipsistic ventures was being conceived by Philip in the mid-50s, a time when most contemporary television and radio was heavily censored and happily prosaic. These strange subversions of the usual tropes will become fully realized later in Ubik, the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, when it was adapted as Total Recall. Berkeley in the 1950s was becoming increasingly radicalized, turning into a haven for open Marxists. Civil rights groups and the growing free speech movement caused the government deep anxiety, prompting the implementation of surveillance and intervention. Philip's second wife, Cleo Apostolides, was part of this left-wing movement, attending rallies and distributing literature, and she'd been noticed. In the mid-1950s, 2 agents from the FBI arrived at her and Philip's home. The agents didn't come to implicitly threaten Philip or Cleo with immediate arrest. Instead, they attempted to exploit the couple's precarious financial situation to convince them to assist them. The agents proposed that Philip and Cleo act as spies. In return, they would be given free, fully funded places at the University of Mexico, provided they agreed to spy on their fellow students and act as informants there. Philip and Cleo refused to cooperate, but the encounter had a brutal and lasting effect. The grim, authoritarian state Philip had dreamed of what would become so omnipotent later in his work, had arrived on his doorstep with 2 android-like men of the system. There was a horrible encounter with the government for a young man whose estranged father was the friendly voice of the radio show This Is Your Government, distributing benevolent advice to the people. There was a clear undermining of the American dream of free thought and free conscience, and would stay with Philip forever, becoming the police and surveillance state in Minority Report, and A Scanner Darkly, where mutinous layers of personages start a circle of spying that has no clear beginning or end. Philip had struggled with anxiety, agoraphobia, and psychosomatic symptoms since he was a boy, but now, because of the underhanded and unconstitutional tactics undertaken by the FBI, he became paranoid. The surveillance and intrusion into his home was legal chicanery. The FBI had claimed that because the agents framed the interaction as a voluntary proposition, offering paid tuition in exchange for information, it was not an interrogation. It was a cynical legal strategy and psychological manipulation intended to intimidate young intellectuals. For Philip, it shattered any lingering idealism he might have had for the state. This newfound cynicism and psychological awakening was immediately channeled into a novel in 1957, Eye in the Sky. It was an artistic leap that brought a new level of structural soundness and thematic maturity to his work. His previous fiction had happily held the chaotic tropes of the pulp sci-fi that he loved, mutants, starships, and telepaths. But in Eye in the Sky, Philip formed a distinct symmetrical narrative. 8 people are caught in a particle-accelerated accident, and while their bodies lie broken on the floor, their minds are forced to cycle through the subjective subconscious of each individual member. It was an attempt at making pure universal empathy plausible, the collective unconscious of Carl Jung, and to express the shared cultural anxiety of the age. Written in the direct aftermath of the FBI visit, the novel was a balm for his own growing ills. Through the protagonist Jack Hamilton, a defense contractor facing ruin because his wife is accused of left-wing subversion, Philip places himself clearly in the fictional universe of his novel to play out and work out the trappings of his own surreal situation. The 1950s were ending, and Philip's life as he'd known it was ending too. He and Cleo left Berkeley and the intellectual underground, and in 1958 they moved to Point Reyes together. It was an attempt to escape the urban stress and the environment that had triggered Philip's agoraphobia. They tried to find some respite in the countryside, but the rural isolation began to cause more ruptures in their relationship. While Philip stayed home to write, Cleo was forced to make a tedious commute back to her job in Berkeley, leaving him alone with his vacillating anxieties and increasing the distance between them. His marriage to Cleo, which had provided a decade of bohemian excitement and intellectual companionship in Berkeley, failed under the weight of his escalating anxieties, his growing agoraphobia, and his increasing reliance on stimulants. The isolation of Point Reyes did not heal their relationship. Instead, it was a catalyst for its collapse. They'd been there only a few weeks when a local neighbor, an eccentric, creative, and tempestuous widow named Anne Rubenstein, walked down the road to welcome them. She and Philip soon began an affair, and Philip filed for divorce from Cleo. It was finalized in early 1959, and Philip married Anne on the 1st of April. Anne had 3 young daughters, and Philip became a father to them. On the surface, Philip had finally constructed the traditional domestic architecture he'd chased since his brief failed marriage to Jeanette Marlin in 1948. He was now a husband, a father, a property owner, and a respectable member of a small-town suburban community, participating in school board meetings and local social events. But the vast, fog-shrouded landscape functioned as an isolation chamber rather than a refuge. The silence of the countryside amplified his internal chaos, and it was during this period of domestic claustrophobia that he wrote Time Out of Joint in 1959, a novel that bridged his early political critiques and his defining sci-fi masterpieces. It was, if any novel can be, ahead of its time in every conceivable way. It features the trippy surrealism of the 1960s before the counterculture had even heard of LSD. It held the paranoia and artificially constructed world that would be closely simulated in The Truman Show, and the personal, candid, and tragic truth of mental illness that would not be shown in popular culture until the 90s. The protagonist, Rachel Gum, lives a peaceful, idyllic life in a small American town in 1959. His entire career consists of winning a daily newspaper contest called Where Will the Little Green Man Be Next? Gum is a celebrated local eccentric, but then strange things begin to happen. A soft drink stand literally disintegrates before his eyes, leaving behind a small piece of paper with the words "soft drink stand" printed on it, and eventually he discovers the truth. The year is actually 1998, and the Earth is engaged in a civil war with lunar colonists. His idyllic 1959 town is a massive, simulated environment constructed by the government to exploit his unique pattern recognition abilities. The newspaper contest is actually a disguised military tracking system used to predict the trajectory of lunar missiles. And it was a revolution, and yet at the time of publication, the novel was either dismissed or ignored. At the same time, between 1959 and 1960, Philip made one final, desperate attempt to break into the literary mainstream, writing Puttering About in a Small Land, Humpty Dumpty in Oakland, and what would become his most famous realist work, Confessions of a Crap Artist. These novels were brutal, ultra-realistic autopsies of the American dream, and when his literary agent and the Meredith agency flatly informed him that these manuscripts were completely unmarketable and no mainstream publisher would ever accept them, this meant that Confessions of a Crap Artist would remain unpublished until a small release in 1975, the only one of his realist novels to be published in his lifetime. Because of these rejections, Philip suffered a total psychological collapse. It was a crushing realization. The industry had permanently branded him as a pulp writer, someone who could only churn out cheap paperbacks with wacky plots. He abandoned his mainstream ambitions entirely, returning to his isolated writing shack with a growing, gnawing sense of desperation and hopelessness. But if the world insisted that he be a pulp sci-fi writer, then he would be, and he would smuggle in every philosophical and artistic trick he had alongside it. And at the time, in his domestic life, Philip tried to become the stable, grounded father to Anne's 3 young daughters, but to cope with the chaos of the household and the financial demands of his new life, Philip's reliance on amphetamines escalated from an occasional medical necessity into a full-scale, daily dependency. He began consuming massive quantities of prescription stimulants and locking himself away to work for days at a time. He later said this was largely to help support the lifestyle that Anne had become accustomed to and expected to continue.
The only drugs that I took regularly were amphetamines, and that was in order to be able to write as much as I had to write to make a living. I was being paid so little per book that I had to turn out a very large number of books. I published 16 novels in 5 years at one point, and I had an extremely expensive wife, extremely expensive children. I mean, she bought a Jaguar, we had a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house on 10 acres of land, and she would see a new car that she liked the looks of and just pull off and buy it. And under California law, I was legally bound by her debts. And I just wrote like mad, and the only way I could write that much, I did 60 finished pages a day, was to take amphetamines, and these were prescribed for me. And you just cannot turn out that much copy, unless you, at least I couldn't. And I finally stopped taking them, and I don't write as much as I used to.
On the 25th of February, 1960, Philip and Anne had their first and only biological child, Laura Archer Dick. According to Anne, the first words Philip whispered were, "And this is for Jane." This newborn baby girl was his to care for now, and to try and heal as he could those first scars that had been cut into him before he was even old enough to recall them. Philip was about to enter the most critically acclaimed, yet most psychologically challenging period of his whole life so far. In 1961, the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had predicted was finally draped across Europe. The Berlin Wall solidified the seemingly unalterable escalation of the Cold War into a nuclear one, and in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought humanity closer than it ever has been before or since to the doomsday. It was in this undertow of the nuclear tide that Philip K. Dick began writing his first work that would force the world, literary or otherwise, to stop and pay attention. He wrote and published his first definitive masterpiece, a novel that could not be dismissed as simple pulp science fiction, The Man in the High Castle. The novel was set in a parallel 1962, and in Philip K. Dick's timeline, the real-world 1933 assassination attempt on President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt succeeds, leaving the United States incapable of recovering from the Great Depression or mobilizing its industrial power to oppose the fascists. As a result, the Axis powers win World War II. After the United States is defeated, it's carved up into occupied territories. Nazi Germany controls the East, and Imperial Japan rules the Pacific coast. The novel was not the typical trope-filled underdog rebels rising story, but instead a work of sincere and deep philosophy on the duality of truth, fiction, history, and oneself in alien circumstances. The Man in the High Castle is itself a four-dimensional, self-consuming work in the shape of Ouroboros. Philip used the Ijil, an ancient Chinese method of future prediction, by casting stalks of bamboo to plot out the novel, and this is exactly the method by which the author inside the novel writes his own work of fiction where the Allies win. There are multiple protagonists rather than just one simple hero and villain, and again, Philip had written another version of himself as one of the primary characters, Frank Fink. Frank is a secret Jew hiding his lineage in Japanese-occupied California, trapped in a job he hates forging counterfeit antiques. At the time, in real life, Philip was seriously considering quitting writing to work full-time to support Anne's jewelry business. And there was also Nobusuke Tagomi, a Japanese official in San Francisco with a secret empathy for America, and Juliana Frink, Frank's estranged wife who lives in the Rocky Mountain states and becomes obsessed with an underground banned book called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. The book within a book written by the isolated author Hawthorne Abenson, who's known as the Man in the High Castle, is an alternative history that describes a timeline where the Allies won. At the end of the novel, Juliana Frink tracks down Hawthorne Abenson at his home, only to discover that he does not live in a castle but just an ordinary suburban house. She confronts him about how he wrote The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, and Abenson admits that he did not plan the book. Instead, he used the I Ching to write it. The I Ching even recited it would be a great success, the first of his career. The Man in the High Castle was the seamless blending of the creative world of fiction with the objective reality in which it was written. It was the line between the beginning and end that all considered and mature narratives must draw. It was an original play on the fourth wall that was a decade ahead of what would come later in Vonnegut's works, Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions. The Man in the High Castle was an international literary sensation, winning the prestigious Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1963. At 22, Philip K. Dick had become a writer, and at age 34, he finally made it as an artist. The Man in the High Castle proved science fiction could be just as meaningful, potent, and sincere as any other genre. It should have been a time of peace and celebration in Philip's life. The exertions he placed on himself had paid off. 1963 was the year when he made it, but it was also when everything began to fall apart. Despite winning the Hugo Award, Philip was still financially very unsound. The award brought no prize money, and initially The Man in the High Castle only brought in a few $1,000s, barely enough to cover his past debt, and certainly not enough to sustain a mortgage and 4 children. Philip would remain financially dependent on Anne's successful jewelry business, a reality that deeply wounded his artistic pride and had been building into an explosive resentment. The stress and inhuman demands of his writing pace had increased his amphetamine use. At this point, the amount he was consuming was dangerous, and Philip began to suffer from intense, drug-induced delusions, telling neighbors and friends that Anne was trying to poison and kill him. There has been no evidence of this procured since, but Philip at the time was convinced. Exploiting the legal loopholes of the time, Philip convinced a local psychiatrist of his delusions about Anne and had her committed to a psychiatric facility for 2 weeks. When Anne was finally released, she discovered the massive pharmacy bills detailing the extent of the drug use that Philip had been hiding. After this incident, the marriage could not be saved. Unable to reconcile with this, Philip fled the Point Reyes home in a moment of anxiety. It was a desperate act in the midst of a severe psychological crisis. He fled to a small, dark and dingy apartment in San Rafael, completely severed from his past, absolutely exhausted, and on the verge of a complete breakdown. He had achieved everything he dreamed of creatively, but just like in all the old fables, it had cost him everything. Yet truly, the writing had only just begun.